So welcome. I'm Rabbi Micah Streifer. I'm the director of La'asok, and I want to welcome you back to this third installment of the Social Justice in Our Texts series. Today we're going to be studying with Rabbi Shmuly Yanklowitz on the topic of On Borders and Migration, how Judaism can guide a nuanced, compassionate approach to immigration. This is a topic that is more pertinent than ever, and it also touches at the very heart of Judaism's ethics and values. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. La'asok is a virtual liberal Beit Midrash. We're a community of learners who come together to connect with Judaism and to connect with each other by studying our sacred texts and by doing so in a progressive, inclusive environment. For those who are La'asok regulars, welcome back. And again, a reminder to everyone, please put your name and your location into the chat so we can see who we're studying with. I want to thank all of our partners. I am grateful to our partner organizations for helping this series come together. And they are the Central Conference of American Rabbis, the CCAR Press, Tzedek Box, Dayenu, a Jewish Call for Climate Justice, the Union for Reform Judaism, Kirva, Keeping It Sacred, Central Synagogue, Temple Israel of Greater Miami, and Temple of Israel in Wilmington, North Carolina. I also want to convey very deep thanks to two individuals, members of the La'asok community who helped make this program possible, and that's Robert Goldman and Lauren Davis. As well, thank you to all who made contributions as you were signing up for this program to help support the program. Thank you for being here, and thanks for making this possible. If you would like to make a donation to La'asok, I'm just going to drop the link into the chat. You can do so either now or following our program at any time, and we're deeply grateful to you for helping make this program possible. As we did last time, I want to start by turning things over to Rabbi Andrew Kaplan-Mandel, who represents two of our partners, Central Synagogue and Tzedek Box, to help us set an intention for this study. So Rabbi Kaplan-Mandel, if you can unmute and take it away.
Thank you so much. So we're going to take a mindful moment to find a slip of paper or an index card. Each month during these sessions, we've been taking a moment to reflect upon the change that we have pursued between our sessions, the ways in which we're turning our study into action. So on your slip of paper, I want to invite you to jot down, what have you been up to over the past month? I know Thanksgiving, for example, happened during the month, so you may have been involved in some sort of volunteer work maybe, or maybe you made a financial contribution to an institution, maybe you did some advocacy work, maybe you did some learning. What did you do in the past month since we were last together? What impact do you hope it had on others, or what impact did it have on yourself? And perhaps what does it make you want to do next? So as you are reflecting and perhaps jotting down what you've done, I'm going to play a nigun. This is a nigun for the month of December. It is Kislev nigun, brought to us by our friends from Nava Tehillah in Jerusalem. I'm thrilled to pass it back to Micah.
All right, thank you to Rabbi Andrew for that that pause, that moment to consider our impact on the world. I'm now very pleased to welcome our speaker, Rabbi Shmuly Yanklowitz. I'm going to drop his information, his bio, into the chat so you can read it yourself. What I'll just say about Rabbi Yanklowitz is that there's one and there's two, is that he is the founder and director of a number of organizations that deal with social justice, both social justice in the Orthodox Jewish world, social justice with regard to animal rights, social justice with regard to adoption and fostering. He's also the author of 27 books on Jewish ethics, and I am grateful that the CCAR Press, who published several of his books and who are one of our partners on this program, have offered us a discount code for us to be able to pick up some of his books as well. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen. We're going to say the blessing for study together. If you'll join us in the blessing, and then I'll turn things right over to Rabbi Shmuly Yanklowitz. Let's join together. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed is the eternal source of the universe, whose mitzvot, whose commandments bring holiness to our lives, and who commands us to immerse ourselves, to engage ourselves in words of Torah.
Thank you so much, Reb Micah. I am a fan of yours and a fan of this program, and feel very honored to be a part of it. At a time like this, where many people feel powerless, I feel one of the top 5 most important things we can do is to continue to come together and to learn together, not only for the sake of community, but for our own depth of understanding, and to reinvigorate our own conviction for standing for kindness and for justice on many levels. The topic today is very close to my heart. I would say it's in my top 3 to 5 that I work on a daily basis, for various reasons, as I may come to if there's time. But in the interest of time, I'm going to jump right in. I'm going to be a little bit of, if you've been with me before, it's a little bit of a moving train. So there won't be so many pauses, but I will try to look at the chat if folks right over there. And I will leave at least 20 minutes for some questions and conversation at the end. So with that, I'm going to start by sharing my screen here with our first source. Okay. Raise your hand if you can see that. All good? Wonderful. Thank you. All right. So I want to start with the question of who is the stranger? Who is the stranger? And we see here in Vayikra, Leviticus, V'ha'aretz lo timacher litzmitut ki li ha'aretz ki gerim v'toshavim atemi madi. The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine, for you are foreigners and temporary dwellers with me. So who is the foreigners? All humanity. All of us. We are the foreigners. Let's go on with this theme. Ki gerim anochi lefanecha v'toshavim we are like foreigners. This is in Divrei Hayamim, Chronicles. We are like foreigners before you. We're just temporary dwellers. Our lives are short, right? In billions of years of the existence of this reality as it's known, we have a brief moment here. We're all going to die soon, and we're just passing through. And so, yes, we're very wedded to our permanence. We're wedded to our stuff. But we are here very briefly. And do we really own anything? It says here in Tehillim, hear my prayer, God. Give ear to my outcry. Be not mute to my tears. For Piger Anochi, I am a foreigner with you, a temporary dweller, like all my forefathers. Now, this is traditionally attributed to David Melech, King David. The king himself says, I'm just a foreigner, right? I mean, who feels they own the world, or at least their land, more than a king? Right? Even the king, that in this existentialist ideology embraces that we as humans own nothing. That's why all of the Jewish denominations support organ donation, right? There's some misunderstandings out there that Judaism is against organ donation, but the majority of rabbis across denominations support organ donation with some theology that our body is not even our own. On some level, the land we live on is not ours. The things I own are not mine. My own body is not mine. There's a sense that this is owned beyond me with the idea of there being a creator and an owner of it all. Now, before this sounds too radical, I don't think we should throw out borders. I don't think we should throw out property law. I don't think we should permit stealing, right? I think there are realities of laws, and we should hold that moral commitment alongside, paradoxically, with the sense that we own nothing, that there is no place that a person belongs or doesn't belong in a certain sense, in a spiritual reality. The Yalkut Shimoni goes further here. God gathered the dust of the first human from the 4 corners of the world, red, black, white, and green. Red is the blood, black is the innards, and green for the body. Why from the 4 corners of the earth? So that if one comes from the east to the west and arrives at the end of their life as they near departing from the world, it will not be said to them, "This land is not the dust of your body, it's mine. Go back to where you were created." Rather, every place that a person walks, from there she was created, and from there she will return. I think that one of the philosophical or perhaps psychological dimensions of racism and of xenophobia is the sense that people have an essence. Now, I don't want to make a hard case for post-essentialism, or to say that every essentialist is a racist, but the notion that women are fundamentally different than men, that Black folks are fundamentally different from white folks, right? That the race of Jews is fundamentally different from the race of other human beings, right? That sense that a Mexican coming from Mexican land, right? That we are a part of our earth. Now, we are a part of our earth. The word for human is Adam, and the word for earth is Adama. Humans are earthlings, right? We are products of our earth, right? And yet the sense that there's a place we belong and that our essence connects to that. Now, to be sure, as a progressive Zionist, I do have some sense of a deep Jewish connection to Eretz Yisrael that is beyond just historical or legal, but that there is a spiritual relationship. But we don't. I think we could spend an hour on that topic, so I'm going to hold off on that. But going back to Yalkut Shimoni, this sense that actually our wherever a person stands is where they belong. Actually, I will say, I will go back to the progressive Zionism for a moment. Rabbi Nachman anachronistically has a post-Zionist Torah where he says that wherever we clap and bring our spiritual energy, that earth below us is actually Eretz Yisrael, right? Israel is conceptually where we are when we bring our deepest moral and spiritual self. So this connection to land and soul is very deep. Now, in Bamidbar Rabbah, says over here, God spoke to Moshe in the desert of Sinai. One who does not make oneself like an ownerless desert cannot receive wisdom and Torah. Hence it says, in the desert of Sinai. So this idea, friends, is actually pretty amazing, that the Torah was revealed in the diaspora as opposed to in Israel itself. Of course, there's so much commentary on that question. Why shouldn't it be that you leave slavery, you have 40 years of wandering, and boom, you're in the land, and that's where you, in the Holy Land, you get the holy word of God. That's where the 10 Commandments is revealed. Instead, it's in the diaspora. Now, if you want a good David Hartman style Torah, this is about the separation of religion and state. You have to show that Torah necessarily comes into place outside of sovereignty to show that necessary separation. But a different path to take is this conversation on what it means to be in the midbar, what it means to be in the wilderness, where everything is hefker, is ownerless, right? As opposed to a very structured society where everything has its own place and owner. That sense of being in an ownerless place and making oneself hefker, making oneself ownerless in order to receive. So I think, friends, this first topic I want to lay out for us today is, I think, a deep Jewish theological notion that we don't own anything. We don't belong anywhere. From a higher spiritual reality. Now, when I say the word spiritual, what I mean here is an elevated consciousness of empathy and care. A sense, I think the opposite of spiritual is narcissism. So narcissism, I'm just immersed in self and self needs. Spirituality, I zoom out beyond the self, where I have a space for care and for empathy. And so this deeper, expansive notion is that, yes, I'm wedded to my stuff. But when I zoom out beyond my life to a more eternal perspective, beyond the temporal, that there actually is a sense that only God is the owner. Now, if the language of God doesn't work for you, we can just say a sense that there's no individual who's in control, ultimately, of ownership. Okay, friends, so let's go to the next idea. The next idea is the need to be a foreigner, not just that we are, but that we need to be. Famously, Lech Lecha, the Lord says to Avraham, go from your land, go from your father's house, go from all you know. to this other place, right? The first Jew chosen because of their commitment, lasot tzedakah u'mishpat, Abraham and Sarah's commitment to justice, why they're chosen as the first Jews, are told, actually, I want you to be foreigner. I want you to be a stranger right away. Soloveitchik picks up on this with Abraham, Rav Soloveitchik. The stranger is indomitable. He may lose a battle, yet had never lost a war. He will never reconcile with political subjection. Roaming, wandering, he will escape persecution and oppression. When the need arises, the nomad stands up and fights for his freedom, and many a time proves superior in battle to the settled king. Abraham's heroism on the battlefield is the best illustration. Here, Rav Soloveitchik, himself an immigrant, multiple times in his life, is here wrestling with this idea of kind of the heroism, right? That the ger, the foreigner, we'll come to the ger in a moment, but the foreigner is not merely the vulnerable category that we should defend. The foreigner is also a heroic category for us to admire. The person who is able to leave all they know for a dream, for a deeper reality. And we are ultimately people of dreams. You know, Elie Wiesel famously liked to comment that it's amazing that Herzl and Freud lived in the same district of Vienna, but that they never met each other. Because if they had met each other, what would have happened? Herzl would have said, "Im tirtzu ein zo agada." If you will it, it is no dream. And Freud would have said, "Ah, you have a dream. Lay down on my couch. I'll cure you of your dream." Right? In fact, friends, that's what the world tries to do to us to some extent, to teach us ideas like, oh, history repeats itself. Everything's broken. We should just be cynics, right? There's no chance to fix things, right? But actually being a people of dreaming, being a people who can see heroes among those who are even vilified. Goes further here in Baba Metzia in the Talmud. One who has not made good in one place, but fails to move and try their luck in some other place, has only themselves to complain about, right? Some notion that actually we are, because our lives are short and we need to manifest our destiny, we need to actualize our potential, that we need to go where we need to go. If it means leaving a marriage, if it means leaving a job, if it means leaving a country, we need to balance loyalty and commitment alongside change and adaptability. Actually, two things about Moda Ani, which I didn't intend to say, but going back to spiritual versus narcissistic, Moda Ani, it could have said, oh, I'm sorry, what is Moda Ani? Many Jews, when they wake up in the morning, the first thing that they recite is a blessing of thanks that we survived. Because the Talmud says we're 1/60th dead in our sleep. So we express our gratitude that we made it. We made it through the night. And we say, Moda Ani lefanecha. I acknowledge or I thank you. But it could have said Ani modeh, Ani moda, right? But it says Moda Ani. Starting not with I, but starting with the words of thanks. So then we say, we call HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we call the Creator Chai V'Kayam. God is living, but also established. And paradoxically, Rav Kook says, divinity is both changing and unchanging, right? So too, to model after that, we are to be evolving and consistent and loyal. So how do we cultivate that sense that the Baba Metzia says that we should be ready to get up and go? Here's the last thing on this idea here. In Pirkei Avot, ve'al tadin et chavercha ad shetagia limkomo. Don't judge your fellow until you stand in their place. Now, can we ever stand in someone's place? Is that possible? Right? I don't know that it is. You know, the University of Michigan, out of the University of Michigan, there was a study that came out a few years ago that the capacity for empathy in America has dropped 40%. Harder for a man to know what it's like to be a woman, harder for a white person to know what it's like to be a person of color, harder for a straight person to know what it's like to be queer, a rich person to know what it's like to be poor, what a documented person it's like to be undocumented, what it's like for a person with a body of abilities to have a body of different abilities, right? What it's like for a Christian to know what it's like to be a religious minority like a Jew or a Muslim. It's getting harder and harder. And yet we think we can understand someone. We think that we can judge someone. And so we see this reality of judgment towards the one crossing the border, of what their motives are, and why they're doing that. And Wiesel famously said we should never call someone an illegal. At the very least, right, our commitment ought to be to stop dehumanizing rhetoric that is consistently used. Whatever our views are on policies, that we should be very aware of how dehumanization works, right? In the Nazi newspapers, they had a column that listed all the alleged crimes that Jews did. Because if you fear the Jew, then you'll hate the Jew. And if you hate the Jew, you can do atrocious things. So too, what is possible in American society for how we come to fear all the gangsters and rapists who cross the border, who are here to steal jobs, and that we should be terrified of because this is an invasion. This is an invasion. And be very aware of how this was used as a top 1 or top 3 issue in the 2016 presidential election, in the 2020, and in the 2024. That this is actually a successful tactic, the sense of external invasion, and that threat can unite us to understand that we need to reclaim what is being robbed of us at this very moment, right from under eyes. Okay, so that's having to do with judgment. That we can still think critically about what policies ought to be without engaging as such. So now we get to what is kind of the most famous Torah, which I'll spend the least time on in terms of gerim. It says in Shmot in Exodus, "V'ger lo tona v'lo tirchatzenu ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Yisrael." So who is the ger? Well, usually if you ask someone who's the ger, they say the convert, and they are correct. Because in the Talmud, the ger is the convert, the person who wants to convert to the Jewish religion, by and large. But the ger in the Chumash, in the Tanakh, is the Gentile living in a Jewish place of power, right? Even further, the ger is just the stranger, right? Because we were gerim, right? Israelites were also gerim, right? So we were also strangers in Egypt, according to Ibn Ezra. The pshat is immigrant. The pshat is the person who has migrated. Speaking of pshat, Professor Tzvi Zohar, who was a professor at Bar Ilan, retired now, mostly of Sephardic halakha, Sephardic customs and law, talks about the thousands of years of history where pshat has normative value. Pshat means kind of the literal or simple read of the text, and normative value means that it's not just that from a drash, from rabbinic play, we can derive law and norms, but also from the literal reading itself, even if it predates and the rabbinic discourse. So here we see this mandate to not oppress, and if we go a little further with that, in Devarim, do not pervert justice for the foreigner, orphan, and do not take a garment of a widow as a pledge. Now, some treat these 3 categories as literal, and some as springboards into conceptual, broader conceptual understanding of vulnerable populations. But what's interesting about the ger, the yatom, and the almanah, the stranger, the vulnerable child, and the widow, is that all ancient Near East ancient cultures, I shouldn't say all, the majority that are studied, at least, engage the yatom and the almanah, right? The widow and the vulnerable child in your community, it is pervasively embraced that these are people to care for. The Torah comes and radically introduces this idea of the outsider, the person who is not the Jew, the person who is vulnerable because they're not protected under the law. This is a radical innovation that emerges in the Bible, in the Hebrew Scriptures. Something that we should be very proud of and understand just how obsessed Torah is with this, whether it's 36 times there's concern for the ger, or 48 times, as the rabbis play with. But when it comes to love, how many times does the Torah say love God, once, v'ahavta l'recha kamocha. How many times, ahavat Hashem. How many times does it say love your fellow Jew? V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, one time. How many times does it say love the ger? 2 times, right? The Torah knows that we will be rightfully inclined to first support our family and first support our friends and first support our local community, right? And our fellow Jew. And yet, even though we might rightfully have a moral commitment to partiality, right? We don't just embrace human love, everyone's equal, right? In my obligations, but rather I do have different obligations to my mother than a stranger. I do have different obligations to someone in Scottsdale, Arizona, where I live, than I do to someone in Synagogue, right? I do have different obligations to a Jew than a Gentile, right? Even though I embrace that partiality over just, blanket universal love, I have to be so sure to not forget that first doesn't mean last, that there's a radical commitment to the one who is still most vulnerable. Hashem shomer gerim, that God ultimately guards the foreigner, and so should we. This is not just physically in terms of rights and basic needs, but also their emotional well-being. V'samachta bechagecha. We should include the stranger included in caring for their rejoicing, ensuring they have mental health and security. Now, what happens when this goes wrong? When this goes wrong, we have the paradigmatic evil society, Sodom and Amorah, Sodom and Gomorrah. Rabbi Eliezer says they issued a proclamation in Sodom saying everyone who strengthens the hand of the poor and the needy and the ger with a loaf of bread shall be burnt by fire, right? That people think of Sodomites as gay men, but actually for the rabbis, what Sodom was actually those who hate the stranger. Sodom was a place where a little girl, the Midrash says, helped an unsheltered refugee, a place who didn't belong and wasn't protected, and they wiped honey on her body and tied her to the city fence until she was stung to death. There were people who didn't fit in the beds, so instead of getting bigger beds, they would cut their feet off so they could fit in the bed. There was a hatred for the foreigner. And so, friends, I believe that this is one of the easiest of social issues to make a Jewish case for. I think there are many social issues that it can be a stretch. It can be my moral leaning that I support this over that. But really, with the complexity of Jewish values and law, it really is stretched to say it's authentically Jewish to support X, Y, or Z. But I really believe that biblically and rabbinically and in contemporary Jewish ethics, that it's very hard to make a case that we don't love and protect the foreigner and the stranger. And I think that this is one of the most Jewish of issues. Number one, because it's our history. Jews for thousands of years have been unprotected, second-class citizens at best, until things got better in America, until sovereignty in Israel, that Jews have such protections. This is our history. Number two, because our sources are obsessed with the ger. And number three, because it remains the rallying cry of politicians who use them as scapegoats, ultimately, and that there is so much momentum on this, and that American Jews have a unique position of power to make a difference on this. Now, what do some people on the far left who are anti-Semites say? The Jews are fake, are fake progressives. They're fake social justice folks. They're just white folks. Jews are just white folks. They don't belong with the brown and black and Muslim folks. What the people on the far right often say who are anti-Semites, they say the Jews are fake white folks. We look like white folks, but we use our power to advocate for the marginalized and for the immigrants, right? We're pro-immigrant, but it doesn't make sense. I thought you're the white establishment. You're supposed to be anti-immigrant, right? So we see some notion of how anti-Semitism kind of intersects with this sense of how Jewish power is used in relationship to the immigrant. Now, let's be clear. Nobody wants any problem solved. I shouldn't say nobody. Those who use immigrants as scapegoats, regardless of their political party, need the scapegoat. It's part of the holding of unconscious fantasies of how power plays out that one has to hold on to this vision of a country under attack in order to create a movement that America can be greater by returning to a place when it was pre-immigrant, which of course is a fantasy. So that unconscious fantasy is crucial to what's playing out on this political level. But I continue to believe that this is one of the most crucial issues for Jews to be on the front lines of. Now, that said, I do believe that for those of us who identify with a more liberal or progressive agenda, that we should take some level of responsibility, only some, for the rise of far-right extremism in the country. And that little bit of responsibility, and there's so much to say about that, partially, I think, is a sometimes failed attempt to demonstrate what the our moral boundaries are, right? So if I'm staunchly pro-life, I might feel you have no boundaries on your pro-choice commitment. Like, how many months is too many months for someone to willfully? I might feel, how old can a child have a trans surgery? Like, give me a boundary. I do believe in any borders, right? So whatever our commitments are, to demonstrate that actually we do believe in a more inclusive approach, but even with a more expansive and inclusive approach, we do embrace some level of boundaries on that. So yes, so we say, okay, I'm pro-immigrant. I believe in the dignity of immigrants and the rights of claiming asylum, and we should expand our numbers of refugees, right? And there shouldn't be for-profit prisons, for these folks, and so on and so forth. Right? There's so much more to say. And the wages of farm workers, and yet, how will I also demonstrate that I don't think that anyone in the world, for any reason, has the right to willfully come into the country at any moment for any reason, without being any security concerns whatsoever. So I do think that burden is on pro-immigrant activists and educators and voters to also, demonstrate a nuanced approach of how we're going to uphold the absolute dignity of people who need to flee, who need to move based on violence, based on economic instability, based on climate change and natural disasters, based on a whole bunch of reasons why a society might not be working for them. And also be able to speak to those who feel that they're unfairly holding the burden as taxpayers, who feel that they are put more at risk without certain security protocol. So friends, in just a moment or two, I'm going to pause to open up the conversation. I want to just kind of sum up what I think I've tried to say so far. I started with the idea that that we as Jews should paradoxically hold multiple truths. Where I think orthodoxy gets it wrong is that there is the question most asked is, what's the halacha? What's the law? And the law trumps everything. I think where liberal Judaism can often get it wrong is the question is, what's the Jewish value, right? That outweighs anything else. And what I think is the most authentic Jewish expression is, what is the dialectical tension? What are the competing values in any ethical debate, in any moral calculus? The competing multiple values that I can hold together to come up with a nuanced approach that brings in multiple concerns of multiple parties, multiple values. And I think we're capable of doing that. I think that's where American Jews can make a unique contribution. Where American Jews cannot make a unique contribution is where every single one of my views and my language for those views lines up perfectly with the Republican Party or perfectly with the Democratic Party. Then I basically have little to contribute other than being another member of society. I think that the American political discourse has proven to be a failed language for healing divides, for bringing people together for complex moral conversations. I think Jews and other groups can contribute different language that can actually offer the potential for people to talk about ideas beyond just screaming the same mantras that Americans have screamed for the last 15 years, which is only wedging us further and further apart. So that was the first idea, that paradoxically, we care about multiple values, and we also care about a spiritual truth that we own nothing, but also want to defend what is also ours. Second idea is this notion that each of us, if things went really bad in America, we would want Canada to open the borders. We would want Mexico to open the borders, right? That we would not understand on any level it being empathetic or compassionate for other countries to close a border in a time of desperate need. That'd be very hard. It'd be very hard for Jews to understand why Roosevelt would send a boat back, why any Jew fleeing the Holocaust couldn't make it here. And so too, that it would be very hard for us to it should be very hard for us to understand why someone fleeing would not flee, and why we should also flee if we're in such a case. And then thirdly, this moral mandate to do what we can within, reasonable parameters, charitable parameters, for what we can do to ensure the safety of those claiming asylum, those who are refugees, and those who are migrating for a host of reasons. And then lastly, what happens when things go really wrong? The Stone and Amurah question, the question of the paradigmatic evil society, and how we can start to identify some of those elements in American society today, in some of the discourse, in some of the policies that separate families, that lock people up, again, in for-profit prisons, that lack the ability to even claim asylum. Okay, much more to say, but I want to honor the timeline that I laid out. And so the way I want to do the questions now, if this is okay with Rabbi Streifer, is to actually take 4 or 5 at once, because I fear that if I take one, I'll take 10 minutes on one, because there's so much to say about all the questions. But if I can take 4 or 5, I'll make some notes and I'll respond, and I'll do that in 10 minutes, and then I'll take 4 or 5 more for the last 10 minutes. If that works for you, that can work for me.
That sounds good to me. There are some questions already in the chat. If it's helpful, I can read through some of them, and that can be the
I would
first.
love for you to read. I would love for you to pick a few and read them to me.
Okay, so let's do that. First, I want to throw a question on the table as part of this first batch, which is, does Judaism offer anything about the notion that immigrants, in addition to us having responsibility to them, immigrants bring something positive to society? That is to say, not only about us accepting them as refugees, but what does the diversity of immigrants bring to our society? We also had a question which was, how does misinformation and social networking increase our challenges on this topic? Someone else asked, how do you balance—
Sorry, can you say that again? How does social networking change our view? Is that what it was?
And misinformation, how does it—
okay, got it. Thank you. Great.
How do you balance love of— you spoke to this a little bit, but how do you balance love of stranger with care of your own society? And I'm just trying to go through some of the questions that were in the chat. Why don't we start there, and I'll bring some more questions to you after that.
Okay. Wow. Thank you. So the balancing of love of stranger with care in our own society. I think that what's easier is to name where I think we get it wrong, rather than what I think is right here. And where I think we can get it wrong, and I think that these are kind of two of the loudest Jewish voices today. One is a radically tribal voice that understands that anti-Semitism is rising, anti-Israel sentiment is rising, and Jews need to very loudly and solely be for Jews, because no one else will be. This is a very attractive and is growing philanthropically and growing and cultivating the next generation of young Jews. That sense that care for our own society is really our sole moral priority. And I think you can make a good Jewish case for that, even though I disagree with it. The other The other trend in the cultivation of Jewish identity today, I think, is one that is embarrassed by particularism and partiality, and embarrassed by association with Jewish nationalism, and embarrassed by the combating of anti-Semitism. That really Jews should almost solely be universalists, and any attention give towards Jewish particularity is something that is too tribal and something that should be immediately kind of shut down. Now, that sweet spot of the intersection of particularism and universalism has many different flavors and manifestations that I think have validity. And people are going to have to figure out their own balance between those two. And I think we should be very light on judgment. I very much love people who want to dedicate their career to supporting the Jewish community, who are rabbis of synagogues or Jewish educators, or work for, work in Israel, for human rights or for the vulnerable. And I think that's beautiful. And I also have many colleagues and friends who view their mission in the world to do purely universalistic, work in what their jobs are as Jews. And so we're all going to find, our own middle ground there. But I think what is wrong is to only choose one. Where that balance of 90%, 10%, 40, 60 is, each of us will navigate our own, because I do believe in finding our calling towards causes. The two questions are, where's my power and where's my passion? Where is my unique power that I can create change? I'm not just doing something that's interesting, right? But I have a unique opportunity with who I am and where I'm positioned in the world to create change. And where is my passion? That I will not burn out today because I care so much about this issue that I'm not just doing it for someone else or because it's a good paycheck, but really I am so fired up about this issue that even when I'm exhausted, I keep going. Okay, so that's to that third question over there. But let me give one interesting example. I think we should let anti-Semites come in as refugees, meaning I think that people who hate Jews or Israel, who need to claim asylum, we should still let them in. And because my category of who should Jewish love be for is not based on reciprocity. It's not based on those who love me. Now let me say the opposite side. I don't think we should work with anti-Semites. I think that there's plenty of anti-Semites doing racial justice work. And thankfully, there's plenty of people doing racial justice work who are not anti-Semites. So I should choose to work with the ones who aren't. So too, there were immigrant rights groups we worked with who October 8th putting out free Palestine messages and say, I'm not working with you anymore. Some of them, they were just confused. We had hard conversations. We rebuilt relationships. Other ones, they really had no empathy for Jewish suffering whatsoever, right? And so thankfully, we can choose people in every cause, just like there were feminist groups who showed no concern for sexual violence towards October 7th victims. We don't have to work with them, right? And there's many, thank God, other women's rights groups we can work with. And so I think there we should be committed to Jewish security as part of our equation of what partners we work with. But it should not affect, in my view, and I hope people will push me on this if you disagree, who is able to claim asylum ultimately. Now, we offer showers at the border. People cross the border, they get detained by ICE, they come out of detention, and one of the first people they meet are these Jews offering them showers, who haven't had showers in a while. And as Wiesel famously said, one way to combat anti-Semitism is head on, but the other way is to continue to live Jewish values on the global stage, right? And I think that we don't do universalistic work primarily in order to combat anti-Semitism. We do it because it's Torah, right? But secondarily, it's also that when the world learns what Jews are about, I think that helps to people to cultivate compassion for us as well. Okay, now to this question about the positivity of the positive elements that immigrants can bring to society beyond just being vulnerable. I think this was part of what I wanted to touch on with this Rabbi Soloveitchik idea of the heroism and the heroic perseverance and adaptability, something we can learn deeply from many in this population. And I think that this is also rooted in the story of Migdal Bavel, the story of the Tower of Babel. that God does not want unity, right? Firstly, God doesn't want a tower built, because if all humanity does unite, I sure hope we could build something better than a tower, right? When humanity unites, we should build a hospital, we should build a school, right? We should build some type of prayer center for people of all faiths, right? We could do beautiful things when humanity unites. We shouldn't just build a tower, right? But secondarily, God doesn't want a unity without diversity. And the story of Tower of Babel, I think, is touching on this idea of 70 languages and the 70 nations, that each one has something very unique to contribute. And that is the importance of being in a multicultural society where we can learn. And that is the importance of the Jewish diaspora. Not just that Jewish diaspora is hedging our bets in case things go wrong in Israel, but Jewish diaspora is also that we have something to share with the world and something to learn from the nations of the world, right? And that is a beautiful part of why I'm committed to living in the Jewish diaspora and not being an Israeli Jew, with all my respect to my Israeli family and friends there. Okay, lastly, and then we'll take the next round. And I'm sorry I speak fast, and people always say slow down, and I just can't slow down. So I'm sorry if some of that is ever hard to grasp what I'm saying. Social media and misinformation. Bill Gates, in one of his closing blog posts of the year, maybe a year ago, said the greatest threat in America is the breakdown of trust. The breakdown of trust in media, the breakdown of trust in democracy, the breakdown of trust in scientists and in medical research, the breakdown of trust in clergy. And when trust breaks down, you get tyranny, right? You get people who capitalize off the sense that no one can trust anyone or anything. And so someone's got to fill that hole. Trust me. Trust Papa Bear, because Papa Bear is going to take care of you, right? And so the question is, how do we rebuild bitachon? How do we rebuild trust? Whether our trust is rooted in God, our trust is rooted in the goodness of humanity, our trust is rooted in ourself, whatever it is, we need to figure out what we trust and how we cultivate trust. Okay, so in epistemology, I would say the lowest level is relativism. Relativism would say, truth is so complicated, there's really no truth. Okay, the next rung I would call up pluralism. Pluralism says, okay, truth is complicated, but there's a little bit of truth everywhere, right? The next rung I would call evaluativism. Evaluativism says, yes, there's a relativity of truth. Yes, there's a plurality of truth, but I don't just give up. I need to evaluate and be a part of a critical inquiry into what is true. And so now you get a world where people say, oh, CNN is true, or Fox News is true, or this social media person I follow is true, and that one's a liar, right? And we then just blindly trust certain media outlets or blindly trust certain, social media personalities we like, and we stop the process of inquiry. And I think that that what we need to do here is rebuild this critical inquiry process of learning. What is my process of learning on critical, complex issues? What are the things I do aside from just read the New York Times in the morning, right? Aside from talk with my friends who hold similar viewpoints or scroll through my social media for 5 minutes a day? What will my process of learning be that is part of my moral commitment to being an informed person? Okay, Reb Micah, back to you.
All right, next round of questions here. How do you distinguish between Jewish values that speak directly to refugee/asylum issues versus those that guide us on immigration needs? That's the first question. Then we have a couple of questions about interfacing with Christians and Christianity. One of them says, since the Talmud teachings were created during the beginning of Christianity and in competition, although not exactly treating Jews as strangers compared to Christian, can you comment on this aspect of us being seen as strangers? So I guess Jewish thought being formulated in the context of being strangers, I think is what it's asking there. And then the second question was, what do you think of engaging as Jews with Christians in the biblical texts regarding treatment and identification of the ger? And I think, why don't we leave it there?
Okay, so, can you say the last one more time, please?
What I think the question is what do you think of engaging with as Jews with Christians in the biblical text regarding these issues? I suppose the point there being that we share these texts with Christians,
Okay.
Even though we might not share readings of them.
Okay. Wow. Okay. I can't believe we have 7 minutes. I wish we had 7 hours. I'm so excited. I'm so excited to dive into that with you all. Okay. So I'll start with number two. It is a very fair question to inquire about how much of Jewish ethics were influenced by our own powerlessness, and how they might have been cultivated differently in eras of power. And that's even more fair given some of the extremism we see among some of the religious Israelis today, who can be punch drunk on power. I used to be Haredi in the black hat world for a few years, living in Mea Shearim. I know that world. I have a lot of love for that world and a lot of challenges for that world. I used to be in the settler world. I live on a hilltop in the West Bank for 2 years in a caravan. I have a lot of love for that world and a lot of challenges with that world. And I understand those worlds very well. And I understand how Judaism is cultivated with when you're born into power very differently from when you're born with a sense of vulnerability and powerlessness. And so I want to just state that I think that it's very it's a very alive question that I want to keep the question alive rather than answer it. And there's so many texts that point to that. Pirkei Avot 4:1, Ben Zoma, Ezehu Gibor. Who is the hero? And the answer is Koveshet Yitzro, one who can control themselves. The hero in that rabbinic notion is not the alpha male who can pull the sword from the rack, is not the hero on the battlefield. The hero is one of inner restraint, right? That's very different. That's very different than what one says, in a period of power. Now, to the first question of Jewish values, how they differentiate between the refugee and asylum seeker. And by the way, there's many other categories there which Trump wants to do away with, like the 8 to 10 different legal categories that one can receive protection from in American society, and some of those categories he wants to do away with. I wish I had time to go through those 8 to 10. But I do think it is a separate category from immigrant. And where I think where we should advocate for the immigrant differently, I think in terms of policy of admission, we should focus on the refugee and asylum seeker rather than on the immigrant. But I think in terms of laws of economic justice, we should focus on the immigrant. That's where we should flip. That the immigrant is particularly vulnerable in stolen tips and in being paid under minimum wage, not to mention under living wage, have many other economic justice vulnerabilities that are very live today. That's why one of the projects I'm involved with is to ensure that workers at kosher restaurants, that the restaurants are not only kosher but also yosher, and that's born out of our boycott 13 years ago of agri-processors in Postville, Iowa. Here's a picture of a woman named Maria, who I met in Postville, Iowa, who was brought by a coyote from Guatemala with the promise that her life would be amazing in Postville, Iowa. Instead, she worked long, hard hours in a kosher meat plant where she was paid below minimum wage and was denied breaks, and where the company had $10 million of bank fraud, and where Temple Grandin said was the worst animal treatment she'd seen. And she's an invisible person, and our job as Jews is to make invisible people visible. Now, so I do think that that the economic justice is just paramount for us, especially in a period of inflation where people are just struggling so deeply to get by. And I think one area where we can reclaim our power in this next era is in ethical consumption. How we as individuals and we as communities are using our buying power to leverage that buying power to protect the vulnerable. Okay, now to the last question there, in terms of how Jews and Christians might engage together on these texts. I want to say yes, but yes with some caution. I'm not a huge fan of what some call Judeo-Christian ethics. I understand why people talk about that, and I understand the potential of building bridges between Jewish communities and Christian communities. Having grown up with one evangelical Christian parent and one Jewish parent. Half of my family is Christian, who I love and I'm very close with. So I love Christians. And I love to study Torah with Jews because I think Jews study Torah differently. And I don't want to see our discourse of learning be watered down if it is exclusively kind of engage in an interfaith realm. I do think having both is important to build bridges with some of those texts that we can share. But I think the rabbinic tradition is just necessary for Torah study. To do Torah study without rabbinic tradition, I think, is a distortion of how those texts have been passed down. So, friends, I want to just close with a bracha for you, and with the hope that you'll give the bracha back to me. That, firstly, on a personal level, that everyone in 2025 and beyond can have a healthy and successful year. But secondarily, that we can use our own power and privilege and opportunities where we do feel secure to support other vulnerable communities. And that I hope that Jews will be on the forefront in many ways of supporting these vulnerable communities. And that there's so many different ways to do that as employers and as people with domestic workers who might come to mow our lawns or babysit our kids, as people who might go to restaurants and know that there's workers in the back. And I'm grateful to Rabbi Streifer, to Lasok, and to all of you for this opportunity to learn with you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm blown away by how much you fit into the last hour of learning. I want to thank Rabbi Shmuly Yanklowitz for this inspiring and edifying teaching. I wrote down, our job as Jews is to make invisible people visible. That's one of the things that I'm taking away, feeling inspired to go out and change the world. I want to thank Rabbi Yanklowitz. I want to thank our partners and our sponsors. I want to thank all of you for being here today and joining us in this study. Our next session is January 13th. We'll be studying with Rabbi Leah Berkowitz on For the Sake of Heaven, How to Disagree Constructively, as we continue our journey through social justice in our texts. Wishing you a happy and a healthy secular new year. Looking forward to seeing many of you back here next month. Take care, everyone. Thank you.